Welcome to Inventory. My name is Paul, and this is a series delving into the inner workings and backstories of game-defining objects with the creators that made them. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the conspiracy board from A Hand with Many Fingers with designer David Cribb, better known as Colestia. A Hand with Many Fingers is a conspiracy thriller that sees you investigating the real-life Nugan hand scandal, a web of dodgy deals, dirty money and CIA chicanery. Your primary tool for doing this is the conspiracy board. Well, I suppose it's just a corkboard really, but conspiracy board sounds more exciting, so we'll go with that. You've seen these boards before in films, TV shows and memes, tacked full of newspaper clippings, maps and photos, with red string threaded between the points of connection by the often obsessive and paranoid investigator putting them together. To fill up the board and uncover the conspiracy, the game gives you a newspaper clipping and photo to get you started. From here starts the loop that you'll be following for the rest of the game. With a name, date and location, you can delve into the cabinets of the archive room and find yourself a reference number. You jot this down, head into the basement and pick out the corresponding box, which will contain more clues. You use these clues to rifle through the archives, get another reference number, pick up the box and so on. I love detective games, so a game like this and an object like the conspiracy board is instantly attractive to me. Sure, on one level it's just a board, but it's such a perfect object for which the key aspects of the conspiracy thriller and detective genres can resonate. The idea of discovering clues, of drawing mental connections between pieces of information, of uncovering hidden relationships. It's central to what makes this game work. So central, in fact, that the object itself came before any kind of story was put into place.
I wanted to make a game about conspiracies, or sort of in that kind of conspiracy thriller vein. And so with that in mind, I think the very first thing I prototyped was this corkboard. But that was quite a long while before I settled on the Nugan hand scandal, which is what the final game is about. It was well before I'd settled on that as the main topic. Was well before I'd sort of figured out what the pacing would be or anything like that. I really just thought, if I'm making a conspiracy thriller, there absolutely needs to be a conspiracy board.
We've already talked about the corkboard's established place in the conspiracy genre and how it serves that genre's themes, but David tells us that it also helps serve the very practical considerations you have to address when making an investigative game.
A lot of these kinds of investigative games, like an issue that you just have to address at some point is like how you're going to convey information that people have already discovered. In something like the Outer Wilds, say, that game has this sort of very complex map of bits of info connected to this planet, connected to this other clue you find. Return of the Obra Dinn has other ways of presenting that information as you discover it. So I guess from the start I kind of knew that there needed to be a way for the player to relatively quickly see the scope of the whole story, and possibly spot this is an area I can investigate more, this is an area I haven't looked into too much. The corkboard seemed like a really natural genre-focused way of presenting that information very transparently.
Though David put the corkboard in as a structuring force for the player, the board ended up showing us an interesting side of game design, where the object ended up making demands of him as a designer, dictating how the game should be structured. This arose out of the fact that a corkboard presented as a blank canvas for people to map their thoughts onto inevitably ended up reflecting the fact that people think in different ways.
Yeah, so many different approaches, and that has been one of my favorite parts of the aftermath of the release of this game, is just people sending me screenshots of how they've laid out the board, or sending me messages about that. I think quite a lot of people do sort the newspaper clippings around the location that it specifically refers to, or the location where the box is categorized under. I think fair few people would sort of have set up all of the key figures on the blank corkboard kind of along the top, and then list all of the relevant information about them underneath, kind of arranging it in like a vertical grid. I mean, like my personal way of playing through was always just like put the first thing you find right in the center, put the next thing like slightly off, and just kind of like build out the concentric circles of connections and that kind of thing. But yeah, definitely like a whole bunch of different ways of approaching it. And like that, I think that also kind of affected some elements of like how the narrative was laid out and that kind of thing. Because there would be like clues that would seem incredibly obvious to me, because I've been laying these things out in kind of these concentric circles, but then do a playtest and see someone lay it out like, yeah, in a vertical grid or something. And just like these two key pieces of information are kind of naturally for them lying on opposite ends of the board. So had to go through some revisions of the narrative to try and allow as many options as possible for how people lay out the information.
Even though the conspiracy board serves a practical function, it still has to be satisfying to use. We're well used to the idea that exciting objects like guns have to feel good in games, but the same applies to more mundane objects too, requiring all sorts of little tweaks we are unlikely to notice as players. David told me that he loves games with tactile objects. It's something he's experimented a bit with in self-described anti-thriller The Interlude, and getting the tactility of the corkboard right is something he's put a lot of thought into.
Like, I mean, like sound design is a huge part of it. I went through so many different variations of the like pin going into the corkboard sound to find one that was kind of nice and tacky. So many other elements as well. Like, it wasn't until pretty late in the development that I added like a little animation of the pin going into the bit of information as you pin it to the board, which just made, yeah. Again, it's the kind of thing you wouldn't notice, but you absolutely notice if it's not there. Like, just made it feel so much more tactile. And yeah, the string as well, I think, went through like a whole bunch of iterations, mostly with like the visual design. Like most of my games tend to be fairly kind of minimalistic, lots of flat colors on surfaces and that kind of thing. But I found that the string, because it's something you're like examining so closely and it's such a like key part of the experience, I think that's probably like the highest resolution texture I've ever used in a game is the string on the corkboard.
While that tactility is part of what makes the conspiracy board in this game an appealing object, I'm particularly invested in the way that it facilitates and mirrors a mental process that moves from overwhelming chaos to satisfying comprehension. In that sense, it reminds me of Return of the Obra Dinn, Lucas Pope's detective game where you roam a deserted ship with a magic watch, trying to work out how everyone on the ship died. That game is completely different in terms of its aesthetics, setting and systems, but both games create a similar feeling. That is, a feeling of accumulating bits of half-understood information that at times feels impossible to sort through, that it feels like you're running out of mental capacity for, before the sweet release of that tension as you find a connection that brings clarity to the clues you've been turning around in your head and can empty them onto the page in the case of Obra Dinn, or the board in a hand with many fingers. We've talked a bit about how the board structures the game's narrative, but I was also fascinated to hear that the board influenced the way David constructed the game's environments that act as amplifiers for the associations that come with the conspiracy board, in particular, paranoia.
I have those experiences as well of just like abandoned university libraries late at night where it's like suddenly the like automatic lights turn on, but there's no one around, and those kinds of creepy experiences. And yeah, in terms of like the layout of the space, I definitely I really liked the idea of there being a sort of a different atmosphere in like the office, where you've got like you can have like a radio playing, and so it may be slightly less creepy, versus kind of the atrium where all of the index cards are, which is like relatively open, and there's like lights, visible light coming from the ceiling, versus then the basement archive, where you've just got this kind of like hum of air conditioning or fluorescent lights or something, very like claustrophobic compared with the rest of the game. I think I went through quite a few different iterations to figure out exactly how close I could manage to have the like stacks together and still make the game like navigable. And as well, like I think that's probably one of the things I'm proudest of with this game, is like all of those like little moments of like the kind of paranoia-inducing moments.
These environments are also built to give the game a kind of mental pacing that stops the conspiracy board from becoming too mentally taxing.
I really felt like the game needed... It needed like negative space, if that makes sense. It needed times when you were just like walking along between locations, or kind of engaging in different things, like looking at the little signs on the archive stacks and that kind of thing. I feel like if the game was just the corkboard and just like looking through all of these newspaper clippings and reports and that kind of thing, it would be extremely draining, or at least like significantly more draining, just because of the like mental energy required to kind of process all of that. And so in particular, like having the requiring that at the very least, like you're going to be walking from the basement back up into the office, kind of mulling over all of these details you've found, or mulling over what might be in these books. I feel like it gives players a chance to kind of like switch off from like just analyzing the nature of the conspiracy, which also like that's like the ideal time for me to throw other things at you and try and build that sense of paranoia.
I think the conspiracy board is a great example of how a mundane and seemingly simple object can be anything but. The board is laden with symbolic associations, subject to a host of complex design considerations, and serves as a vital structuring force that facilitates the game's story in a thematically consistent form, so much so that it ends up bending the space around it to meet its demands. Corkboards, it turns out, can be powerful objects. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss upcoming episodes of Inventory, and to hear the full unedited interview with David, where we talk about a broader range of subjects, check out the description below where you can find a link to the podcast version of this interview. For more videos, writing and podcasts about game objects and video games, check out getobject.net, and if you want to support me to help me keep making videos like this, head to patreon.com/getobject. Thanks.